Hello, everyone. This is Lily Moloch from the Nature Conservancy in New Jersey. We co-hosted the Owls of New Jersey webinar with Dr. David Puma. Apparently, we had some technical difficulties with the recording function, and my portion of the live webinar, as well as maybe the first minute of Dr. Puma's presentation, have been cut out. So I am going to record myself going through my slides again, and I will try as best I can to fill in the small amount of content that was cut out from Dr. Dave LaPuma's portion of the webinar. So the topic of the webinar was the owls of New Jersey, and specifically the species that are found on a series of studies being conducted at the South Cape May Meadows Preserve. The speakers for the webinar will be myself and Dr. David Puma. As I mentioned earlier, I work for the Nature Conservancy in New Jersey as the marketing coordinator. TNC owns and manages the South Cape May Meadows Preserve, where much of today's presentation topic takes place. Before my time in my current role, I was actually a land steward for the South Cape May Meadows Preserve for 2 years. I also grew up near the preserve and spent much of my childhood exploring the trails, so I'm very excited to be here today talking to you about how amazing this preserve is and some of the exciting projects that take place on this preserve, like owl banding. I am joined by Dr. David Puma, previous director of New Jersey Audubon's Cape May Bird Observatory. He received his PhD from Rutgers University, where he studied the effects of fire on the federally endangered Cape Sable seaside sparrow. For the last 2 decades, David has been engaged in research on migration, from the macro scale, like weather surveillance radar, to the micro scale, like individual tracking of northern saw-whet owls and American robins, and mass recapture of ruby-throated hummingbirds. Today, David is a VP for Cellular Tracking Technologies, a Cape May tech company that makes telemetry devices for tracking wildlife, which gives David the opportunity to work on many exciting and rewarding wildlife conservation projects around the world. But before we dive into the main topic of owls and the owl banding studies taking place at South Cape May Meadows, I just wanted to give a quick history of this preserve. It's a unique preserve with a really fascinating history and restoration story. Before South Cape May Meadows was the beautiful preserve that it is today, believe it or not, there was actually a Victorian resort town situated right out on the beach. This town, called South Cape May, was established in the 1840s and included a modest number of vacation cottages, a railroad, and a massive elephant structure, which you can see in the upper right corner of this slide here. Over time, storms took a heavy toll on the town, and the Atlantic Ocean advanced inland. Businesses and homes were either destroyed or physically relocated to drier ground. The final straw for South Cape May was the Great Hurricane of 1944. Any remaining houses were damaged to the point of being unlivable. After the floodwaters became less intense, a portion of the devastated area reverted to its natural state of meadows, low grasses and shrubs, mudflats, and wetland areas. Salt water overtook the dunes and wetland, allowing invasive plants like Phragmites to displace native vegetation. Migratory songbirds and waterfowl no longer had a local source of fresh water, and surrounding communities experienced severe flooding even during average storms. Residents finally reached out to the federal government for help. A major project to restore the habitat began in 2004. It was a collaboration between the Nature Conservancy, the NJDEP, the Army Corps of Engineers, and the local communities. The goal was to return the degraded landscape to a more productive and natural state to benefit both the wildlife and the residents of local communities by adding protection from coastal flooding. The Army Corps of Engineers' solution was to replenish the dunes and install a system to capture and move water. The Nature Conservancy worked with them on this plan, helping to maximize the design's benefits for nature and wildlife as well as people. So this is a really great before and after comparison. On the left here, you can see how thin the beach is becoming. It's quite degraded. And on the right, you can see it's much wider and it has been replenished at this point. You can also see these mounds here, which are the taller and stronger dunes that were put in through this project. So you may be wondering if this major project worked. Well, the restored landscape in South Cape May has provided a significant level of storm and flooding protection for the surrounding communities. A study completed by TNC revealed that Superstorm Sandy, which had the same level of storm surge and 15 times the precipitation as the storm prior to the 2007 restoration, caused only 1% of damage to the homes and the property. So not only did this restoration project lessen the effects of flooding, but it provided important habitat for beach nesting birds like American oyster catchers and piping plovers. Today, the beautiful 200-acre South Cape May Meadows Preserve has become a world-class destination for birding. To date, more than 350 species of birds have been documented at this preserve. The preserve is great for recreational purposes and features over 2 miles of nature trails, as well as many visitor-friendly amenities like benches, a digital kiosk, interpretive signage, and much more. Some exciting projects currently underway at this preserve are geared towards making the preserve more accessible. This includes a new ADA-compliant boardwalk, parking lot upgrades, and updates to the existing trail system. The preserve also serves as an excellent resource for scientific studies. We have partnerships with the Cape May Raptor Banding Project, New Jersey Audubon's Songbird Banding Project, and of course, the volunteer-led Owl Banding Study. With all of that background information out of the way, I am now going to turn it over to Dr. Dave LaPuma so he can dive further into the Owl Banding Project taking place at South Cape May Meadows. As I mentioned in the beginning of this clip, a portion of Dr. LaPuma's presentation did get cut off. He made an introduction of himself and also to the owl species that are found in New Jersey. He noted that while there are 8 owls that are native to New Jersey, he is mainly going to be focusing on the owls that he comes across in his studies in the Cape May area.
Something other than, oh, here we go. Most of the species in the state are something other than stable. So there are 2 species on here, northern saw-whet owl, which I'll talk a lot more about, and great horned owl, which you see pictured on the slide, that are listed as stable. But most species are either regional priority, special concern, threatened, or endangered. And that's really important to keep track of and keep thinking about as we kind of go through this presentation as well. So the outline of the talk is really to give you kind of a brief history of the research that's happened at the South Cape May Meadow Preserve. Talk about how we've expanded that research in 2022 with some telemetry devices, and then thinking about, and in 2023, as a long-term study kind of winded down, and we're looking at bringing that into the future. Again, I'll get to that momentarily, but usually I would do an acknowledgement slide at the end of a talk, but I think it's worth acknowledging the fact that the stuff I'm talking to you about today is really stuff that was done by many people over many years. And in fact, one person in particular for many years. So there are several folks through working with the Cape May Bird Observatory, New Jersey Audubon, and the Raptor Banding Program who were doing owl research prior to 1980. But Katie Duffy, who was also doing it prior to 1980, really funded herself the owl project that was carried out at the South Cape May Meadows all the way up through through 2022, 2023. The winter of 22-23. So she really deserves the accolades of being the person who made sure that every year data was being collected. The folks that I've been working with, Charlie Roberto, he was a sub-permittee under Katie for many years, so he worked closely with Katie. He's kind of picked up the reins of this project. Michael Lanzone and Dr. Trish Miller are the other 2 who are collaborators with myself in the future of this project. So why Cape May? Again, if you've been here, you might know this already, but Cape May is this massive funnel point for migratory birds in the fall. As these cold fronts move across the landscape from west to east, high pressure builds in behind them, bringing northwest winds, Those northwest winds convey the birds that are coming south anyway, but push them towards the shoreline. And what you end up with is this concentration at what is known as the first kind of funnel point along the East Coast at Cape May. We do see this at points further south, but it really is most concentrated at Cape May. So it's probably one of the best places, not probably, it is one of the best places in the world to study migration, especially fall migration. So if we look back at the banding data, this all comes from all these large data sets that I'm going to show are coming from the bird banding laboratory, which anybody who bands birds in North America has to report those data to the banding laboratory, and the banding laboratory can disseminate that information out to researchers. So this is all data coming from the banding lab, coming from Katie's permit, but also the other permits of folks that have been banding in Cape May between 1981 and 20. And so here's the distribution of owls that have been banded. A couple interesting things here. One, obviously, you see northern saw-whet owl is the largest, represents the largest number of individuals that are banded by magnitude, right? Also, long-eared owl is pretty high up there. And then barn owl is the third highest. And what's interesting about barn owl is all those big data points are back in our history. And I'll talk about that in a second when I show barn owl. But it's very interesting. That's a species that has declined precipitously in New Jersey, and a species that deserves attention and is getting attention in different forms. Barred owl, eastern screech owl, and great horned owl. These are the owls that we think of as most typical as residents in Cape May. Some migrate through. In fact, we had a migration of barred owls. We had an uptick in barred owls a few years ago that we attributed to migration in the fall and winter. But we do have resident barred owls. And in fact, they've become more common on the island. They were a species that was very rarely encountered on Cape Island itself. They're more up in the marshes to our north. And they've become more common as breeders in Cape May, which does beg the question of how is the habitat change that might be favoring them? And then short-eared owl, that's an owl of open marshes, typically a wintering owl or an owl in passage migration. They like salt marshes, they like to feed over marshes, as do barn owls. And short-eared owls are just not as common in the meadows. When I refer to so I'll refer to the South Cape May meadows as the meadows. They're less common in the meadows, and so they're less encountered as a potential banded bird, although we did encounter several in the most recent years. And there's a slide from 1972 of a long-eared owl being held by a bander, just kind of demonstrating, just reiterating the history of owl banding that's occurred in the Cape May region. So again, I told you I'd cover some brief history. And we're standing on the shoulders of these historians, of these historical researchers. Most of you are probably familiar with the name Pete Dunn, and Clay Sutton, and Paul Curlinger. Pete Dunn was the director of the Cape May Bird Observatory for 30 plus years. Paul Curlinger was the director for several years in the 90s, and Clay Sutton is kind of Clay and Pat both together are just been forces in avian research, butterfly research, natural history of the region. And of course, you always need someone to push the paper along. So Robert Russell was that person. And Robert Russell was actually the one doing the observation. So in this case, they were doing a study observing migratory owls using an infrared, a night vision scope. So scanning in the dark to count birds migrating. And if you've ever tried to do that, it is very difficult. And this is back in the 90s, so even more difficult. The technology has come a long way since then. But what they found was that they observed owls. They found that barn owls were one of the most dominant, in fact, the most dominant species, and in fact had a very early migration. So you can see in that graph in the upper left of that panel I just put up, some of those highest spikes are occurring in early October, mid-October, into kind of the third week of October, and then it kind of levels out, and then you get a little pop there in November. Also, when you're looking at the time of the night, most of the owls were detected early in the night, and then you get a linear decline over the course of the night, which is interesting because they in the paper they actually compare this. There was already owl banding data in Cape May that shows a very different picture, which is that the birds typically are being caught later in the night or distributed across the night, and this is probably a function of that exodus that's happening. So these are observers that are looking through a scope, and so they're most of the birds they're going to see are ones that are leaving the landscape, and that's happening at the beginning of the night. When it gets dark, birds get up and they start to migrate. So it's probably one of these cases where we have a sample bias that's just different from the way that we sample banded birds. But this is also important because you can take both of these data sets together and start to say something about populations. And also, one of the cool things that came out of this project was looking at weather. And I say cool because, again, as we think about doing research now, these data sets that were collected back in the 20, 30, 40 years ago are inferring or influencing the way that we set up our designs, because you can see here, there's a clear, distinct difference between the number of birds observed when the winds are light versus when they are heavy, and when they are coming from the north versus other directions, in this case, the south. So in this case, we have fall migration. The north winds are going to convey birds, so we get a lot more birds moving under north winds, but light north winds for owls, which might be different or contrary to other species like diurnal migrants, where we might see more birds moving on heavier winds. And so this is also another way that they're using historic raptor observing techniques, so hawk migration observations, to try and observe owls, which is really groundbreaking at the time. And there's been very little of that research done since in that way. Another paper that was back in 93, this is actually a 10-year study of mortality. So George Luce basically traveled from North Cape May to Atlantic City for work every day, and along that route was counting dead raptors on the side of the road. And in fact found as far as the highest numbers, they were saw-whet owls and screech owls. And the most important take home, I think, from this is just the timing of those observations. So you can see the big spike in screech owls in December. It's the same, it's less of a spike, but it kind of mounds around December for saw-whet owls, which if we think we understand saw-whet owl migration, which is that it really ends in November and really trickles out in November, and then anything else that's being observed is probably wintering birds. These data actually suggest that those saw-whet owls are wintering in our area, and that's important for conservation. So it's one thing to conserve stopover habitat for passage migrants; it's very important. But it is another and possibly different for preserving land for wintering birds. So this is one of the earlier examples of data indicating that saw-whet owls were wintering, not just stopping over in the Cape May Peninsula. And then Katie Duffy and Paul Kurlinger published some of the most comprehensive data sets, especially because Katie was working here pretty much every year on owl movement in Cape May Point. Some of the earlier data back from the 80s showing the kind of the temporal phenology of migration of long-eared owl, barn owl, and northern saw-whet owl. And if you look at the bottom frame is barn owls. You can see how it's shifted to the left. So these birds are moving through earlier in the season. And then long-eared and saw-whet are pretty much overlapping with each other. There's a little variation, but it's mostly overlapping with each other, which then goes kind of to explain why those are the two most common migrant species that are being caught in the nets during the current operations. And here's just some of the data from that period as well. If I'll show some graphs showing the change over time, but if you are quick with your eyes and you look at barn owl, you'll see the early years, those 80, 81, 82, 83. We're looking double digits, and then a precipitous drop off after that, and that drop off has continued to today. And then again with time of night. So this is important because of the next paper that comes after. So most of the birds are being caught before dawn. So think of these as 4-hour periods. So early night would be the first 4 hours after sunset, the middle of the night are the second 4 hours, and the last 4 hours leading up to sunrise. And so what you can see here is northern saw-whet owl, the big black bar, and to an extent, all species are being caught more in those before dawn hours. So presumably that's when birds are landing, coming back in, they're getting lower in altitude, they're thinking about finding a place to roost for the day, and they're more inclined to be flying into nets that are set up on the ground. And so later on, Katie and Paul and her partner at the time, Pat Metheny, published a paper comparing two data sets. So basically the early years, the 80s to the 90s, or the late 80s and into the 90s, where they had added a callback, a player. So the player is playing the advertisement call of the male saw-whet owl, which then is to bring in owls towards the nets. And again, just comparing those two, so that you can see the top section of this graph is passive, called passive. Those are not using the player, and then on the bottom from 1989 to 94, using the player, the audio lure. And I've highlighted there for you, so it kind of jumps out. But basically, you got two things going on here. One, you've got more birds. So the average, the mean of those, sorry, the total number, 632 in the passive and 632 and 38 in the audio lure is not very different, but you're catching more birds on less nights. So if you look at the number of nights, you've got about half the nights in the audio lure graph, and you've got much fewer net hours, and therefore the last value all the way on the right, owls per 100 net hours, is really the big one that jumps out. You're getting 3 owls per 100 net hours with the audio lure, and 0.5 owls per 100 net hours with the passive method, which is awesome because this actually allowed for using less nets, spending less time out there, and I don't have it there, but basically shifting the capture time earlier in the night, which is important for one's sanity when you're spending every night up trying to do owls. If you can go to sleep a little earlier knowing that you've caught most, you're going to be a better person at the end. So I call this the modern day owl banding. We got through most of the wonky stuff. So if you stuck around, now you'll get to see some pretty pictures. The modern day owl setup is several, the nets vary in number, but if you look at the map, you can see the red lines are the quote unquote bigger owl nets. Typically, there's some smaller ones mixed in, but they're bigger, they're more in the open, and they're set up to catch some of those larger owls, and they also catch saw-whet owls. But they also keep larger owls out of that yellow line. That's called the saw-whet lane. So you see it kind of looks like the letter I. Those two short, the top and bottom short lines are actually blocker nets. So if a bird is flying in and wants to wants to investigate a larger bird, they usually will get caught in those blocker nets. And then the long line is actually in a tunnel of vegetation, of cedars and hollies that's really closed in all the way on top and around. So any saw-whet owl can get in there, respond to the caller. You can see the speaker is the speaker icon is the caller, and they'll get caught in those nets, but also protecting them while they're in those nets from any larger owls coming in. And you know the frequency with which you check those nets depends on what's going on at the time. It's always within 30 minutes or less, and that's very standard for bird banding. In this modern day, back in the day, it could be an hour back in the 70s and 80s, but now we do it at least every 30 minutes, and then when it's very cold out, or if we've got large owls vocalizing nearby that we know there's barred owls or great horned owls around, it can be as frequently as every 10 minutes, which can be a hefty walk. And so pictured in this picture here is Katie Duffy holding an owl, looking down at it, and in the upper right is my daughter Rosa a few years ago watching Katie process owls. And this is kind of an important anecdote. Katie always made sure that she was sharing with the community. And so we've tried to carry that on in our taking the kind of evolving the project. And you'll see momentarily, actually you'll see now. So Katie would do these kind of impromptu outreach events at the South Cape May Meadows parking lot. And I think Lily's probably seen a lot of those. But my kids are in the bottom right picture with my friend and colleague, Mike Lanzone. His kids are in there as well. And so we've grown up and we've had our kids growing up in this environment where they can go out in the fall and always count on Katie or one of Katie's volunteers to come and bring an owl out and talk about it. And I can tell you that those have left lasting impressions on them, and have inspired them to become. I mean, one of Mike's daughters now is really interested in becoming a hummingbird researcher, but all of this exposure to research has really kind of stoked her scientific flame. So we had an opportunity in the winter of 2018-19. I was working for New Jersey Audubon at the time for the Cape May Bird Observatory. And we had started a banding station in collaboration with the Nature Conservancy. Lily mentioned it before, the Songbird Station and Cellular Tracking Technologies, where we set up a nice array of receivers so that tagged animals could be tracked on that array, small songbirds. Katie's season had wrapped up, but the owls kept coming. So we opened up a few nets, and I'll show you the nets. But in those 2 nets, we caught 26 saw-whet owls, including 2 retraps from previous banding. So one of them was from a year prior that Katie had banded, and another one was banded near New Paltz in 2017. New York, we recaptured it in December of 2018. and that bird was found dead on December 24th, right outside the Cape May National Golf Club, hit by a car. So again, remember that previous study with mortality from, and most of those are from cars. It's still a real issue, but by having these birds banded and having this network of banding stations, we can actually learn so much more about where these birds have come from, and if there's mortality, how those mortalities relate to the source of the birds. And it's funny here because we were working out there doing saw-whet owls, but there was another group that TNC partners with. It was the state of New Jersey doing woodcock studies. So they were catching woodcocks, we were catching saw-whet owls. We had the banding station. We were able to work together and use the same station. And this might be one of the few pictures of a saw-whet owl and two woodcocks in existence. But it was a very exciting project and nice collaboration. And so there's the two nets. The two nets are in red. So I grayed out the normal net arrays, and we only put two nets out and played the saw-whet caller, and we were able to catch all of those saw-whets at that site in that year. So in 2020, we know what happened. We had a pandemic, and unfortunately, Katie could not come down. She had not been absent for many years. She did put myself and Trish, Mike, and Charlie on her permit so that we could continue the project during that season. We're working out of a tent, with masks, out in the field in the rain and the mud. So you can see there's a picture of Mike carrying a bunch of hay, putting it out because we had gotten massive flooding out there that year. We did operate the standard net array, and there's a saw-whet in the tent there's a few saw-whets being held in the tent. But it was a challenging season, but it allowed us to keep it going. And it was a big season, lots of birds coming through. And despite having to be masked up in this close confinement in the tent, we did spend a lot of time stargazing, and it was a pretty decent place to be social distancing from everybody else. So I just want to mention Project OwlNet because Katie Station has always been part of Project OwlNet. This is a national collaborative effort to have people banding saw-whet owls specifically, but also any owls that come through, and a way for us to better understand the connectivity. So the owls that come through Cape May, we can band them, we can measure them, but we really don't know where they come from unless they're caught somewhere else. So Project OwlNet provided that kind of first level of connectivity data. Yes, it's biased because it's limited to the sites that are participating. So there's lots of birds moving in between those sites that may never get encountered, or you don't know where they're going. But it was a great kind of evolution in collaborative research, which has led to a lot of our understanding of saw-whet owls. But you can see there's a lot of missing spots in that map where birds could be going. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of, I'm going to kind of zoom out a little bit again, just to cover some of those species that I mentioned. Again, barn owl, I mentioned this earlier, steep decline, and you can see that decline there. There's an old set 1972, I think, image of a barn owl, a bander, and then a more recent one, not from Cape May, because we have not caught a barn owl in Cape May in many years. If you look at the dates, you're looking at 1981 all the way on the left to 2004. So there are no barn owls being caught at this site, or haven't been barn owls caught at the site in a long time. Now, Lily did mention the old South Cape May Meadows and the flooding. So in that red circle that she mentioned is the site. Kind of at the left end of that red circle where it's still flooded is where the old banding site used to be, where the old owl banding site used to be, where they caught most of the barn owls. So we do think barn owls are declining because that picture actually is what our marshes look like typically in New Jersey. We're getting lots more subsidence, lots of erosion, lots of encroachment, and so we're losing marshes. We've gained marsh because of the restoration work, but we haven't gained barn owls since that restoration work. So that's kind of alarming. So that's definitely something we want to be looking at. Saw-whet owls, on the other hand, we see lots and lots of them throughout the historical banding record. We get years where there's lots and we get years where there's few. And that's probably very much related to their prey availability. Excuse me. And so we expect fluctuations like that in a predator like a saw-whet owl. Interestingly, remember we talked about the audio lure. That's the year the audio lure went in. Now, we don't have a lot of data prior to that 1988. But what kind of jumps out at me, though, are these bigger spikes that we see following the audio lure. So to me, that data looks like we brought the audio lure in, we're able to, if there are birds around, we can attract them to the nets. And so we're going to increase our chance of capture with that audio lure. If there's no birds around, the audio lure is not going to make much of a difference because there's no birds there, and we're going to catch the ones that are there. But in times when there are lots of birds, we get these big spikes. You can see one year, 635 birds. That was a busy year. 366 birds or 86 birds. In the modern era, though, in the last 10 years, we're seeing a dampening of that effect. So are we seeing less saw-whet owls? I'm not sure. Definitely something we want to be looking at and want to be investigating, because it's a common species now, and our goal is to keep common species common. And we are an important stopover site and possibly an important wintering site for these birds. Long-eared owl, this is very interesting. We see a big decline in the 2000s, right into the early 2000s, we get a big drop, and it seems to be leveling out. The question is, are we sampling, is the habitat changing so the long-eareds aren't foraging in the area as much, or long-eareds declining? Long-eareds are a species of concern, and so we need to be looking at them as well. Short-eared owls are very interesting. We caught one a few years ago. They're a marsh specialist, so they tend to be up in the salt marshes. They're not a species super common at the site in the Meadows, so we don't catch many of them, and I don't think our data is really indicative of any population, obviously, because it's so few. So in 2022, 2023, we started asking the questions, okay, we know a lot about kind of the numbers of the birds that are coming through. There's not too much that's alarming about saw-whet numbers yet, but the big missing link about saw-whets is we know they come through the Meadows, but like what are they doing here? How long are they sticking around? Is this site really important for them, or are we just catching them as they're moving through? And not only is this site important, how does this site fit into the Cape Island matrix of habitat? How does the Cape Island matrix of habitat fit into the Lower Cape ecosystem? And how is that Lower Cape ecosystem important for stopover for not only saw-whet owls, but American robins, American woodcock, and other species that tend to be wintering here? So we had an opportunity with the introduction of the Cape May Point Science Center. There's a property just adjacent to the Meadows that gave us access to have a house where we could do some work in the winter when it was colder, set up some nets. So that yellow star is the secondary site, and the red stars for reference, that's the saw-whet lane that Katie manages. I apologize, I've got a cough and it's really bothering my throat. So in 2022, 2023, we established this secondary site. We didn't install it until after Katie's season was done and she had already pulled out. We only used 4 nets with 1 playback device, and the goal was to attach new transmitters to candidate saw-whet owls to actually track their movement throughout as long as we could. So the transmitters we were using, we knew would give us about 6 months of data. And so basically we were tracking their habitat use in Cape May if they stayed, or if they went south of us, and then hopefully when they went back north up to their breeding grounds. And this is again as part of a larger Lower Cape May Lower Cape stopover project that is sponsored by the Cape May Point Science Center and Conservation Science Global, and is done in conjunction with the Nature Conservancy as well now. So we set up, you can see in the upper right, there's kind of our little setup of nets with the playback. And on the first night, not only did we catch saw-whet owls, but we caught 2 barred owls that were coming into the saw-whet collar, which of course that's why we put up those blocker nets. And so that evening was very exciting and very busy with the 2 barred owls and that saw-whet owl going, can you get me out of here before you let those barred owls go, please? There's the close-up of the barred owls. But during this project, we caught long-eared owls. And so here's a long-eared owl being banded, or having just been banded. So that's the federal, if you're not familiar with bird banding, the USGS issues these bands. They're all unique, and so each band has a unique combo on it. So if the bird is recovered either found dead or recaught at another station, that band can be reported and its movement can be tracked. I just saw it out on the hand. So we do call the standard measurements, like we're measuring the wing, the weight. We look at molt. Molt helps us age the bird. And we look at fat, which gives us a measure of their physiology. And then to look at molt, just one of the coolest things about these birds is they have a chemical called porphyrin in their feathers, which fluoresces under black light. So you can take a black light and shine it right on the wing, and it will jump. The new feathers have the more porphyrin in them, so they'll be bright pink, and the old feathers will not be. They won't fluoresce. And so a bird that was born in this case, we're talking about, November, December, a bird that had been born the previous June would have all uniform feathers. So we know that if it had all uniform feathers, that it was a hatch year bird. And so this bird is an after hatch year bird. This is it's maybe a third year bird. It's got several groups of feathers. Some are fluorescing less, but not fluorescing, and then others are not fluorescing at all. So it looks like it's got 3 generations of feathers, probably a third year bird. And so we take the basic measurements, which give us information about age and sex, which is important, and condition. But if we want to know where these birds are going, we need a way to track them. And until now, there's been very little capability to track. We can put small transmitters that can ping a network called the Meadows network, which there's a Meadows on one of Lily's slides. Actually, you can see the Meadows antennas up above the kiosk. That's great, but it also depends on the Meadows network. So you have to have enough stations to pick up movement. And while saw-whet owls have been transmitted with Meadows tags, the amount of data you get is pretty low. So in order to leverage an existing network that's pretty ubiquitous, cellular tracking technologies came out with the first cellular unit that could actually ping cell towers. So instead of it doesn't collect data, it just sends out a signal, and it actually collects cell data on the cell towers, and you get a general location. You don't get a specific location like a GPS, but you can get a general location, which is enough to map out stopover habitat, use, like, is it staying in Cape Island? Is it leaving Cape Island? And then any migration that bird makes outside of the site. I showed in this image here, you can see, if you look closely at the person, I think that's Mike's hand. No, Mike's facing, it's my hand. If you look at my hand holding that harness material, it's clear. So that's a plastic beater's thread called Stretch Magic. You can get it at Michael's. And so that was what was typically used for harnessing most small birds. We used that on 5 transmitters that we put on the saw-whet owls. All 5 of them seem to have got out of their transmitter harness within a week and the transmitters dropped. And because they don't have a GPS location, we could never find them again. Very expensive experiment. So we did later find, in the same season, we found this spectrum material. These transmitters can be as light as 2.5 grams. They ping cell towers. But we found this spectrum material, this white material, which is soft, really, really smooth. There's no abrasive qualities to it. Lies flat. It's a tubular woven material, so when it lays against something or gets pulled on, it's flat, which is what we want. It can be sewn together. It's super light. It's actually lighter than that Stretch Magic material, which is hard to believe. And saw-whet owls can't bite through it. So the 6th transmitter we made using this harness material and put that out on an individual. And again, you probably read this already, but they check in every time they hit a cell tower. So you can monitor that transmitter bird every day, multiple times a day, depending on how it's programmed. And it can answer some of these broader questions of stopover habitat use and timing of movement. So again, I mentioned the choosing those right materials and the issues with the Stretch Magic and Spectra. And so here's our little buddy getting her fitting. So you can see the material, you can see a little leather breastplate. All of that gets worked into the feathers. So it's all under the feathers in the end. This is the initial putting the transmitter on. I think she wore it phenomenally well. There she is again. Now it's kind of been worked in, and Mike's kind of putting the final attachment, final touches on the back. And so here are 3 images of the same bird. You can see the transmitter in the middle image just peeking out under the feathers and the antenna extending past the tail. And the picture on the right is hard to see any antenna, but it is there. And that bird perched for about 20 minutes. And we had a thermal imaging camera, which we could watch, a scope that we could watch it preen and kind of look back there and worked its feathers and shook around a little bit and then flew off into the night. And in fact, spent a long time in Cape May. So these red dots are the locations that are estimated by the cell locate transmitter. And those green circles are the potential error. of those locations. So you can see it's not very good at getting a precise location, but it's very good at telling us, did the bird stay on Cape Island or not? Or at least, yeah, all of this is, you can see the Cape May Canal kind of running off to on the upper right. So we knew the bird was on the island. We knew it was staying on the west side of the island near the magnesite plant. Sometimes it moved into the city. I don't know what was going on at the Eastland Theater at that time, but it seemed to be moving around. What was interesting, though, was that historically there were no records of northern saw-whet owl in Cape May after, I don't even think after February. This bird stuck around until April 26th. And so what I'm showing you now is the application that we have, a phone app, where whenever time the bird would check in, data would be sent and it would give me an alert on my phone. I would open it up and I could look at different parameters. So what I'm looking at here are two things. Up at the top graph is distance traveled in kilometers, and the bottom graph is activity. Activity is measured from an accelerometer that's inside the transmitter. So whenever the bird moves, it registers activity and it summarizes that. And so if a bird's foraging, going out foraging locally, it's going to have some activity. But if a bird migrates a great distance, the activity is going to go way up. So you can see that migration spike, those migration spikes and the activity spikes are correlated. But look at everything to the left of those spikes. You can see in activity, there's some activity that's all like December 18th all the way up to April 26th. So when I was getting these, the bird would check in every day, and every day I'd look at it and go, oh, it's still in Cape May, and it's getting late. Why is it still in Cape May? And a logical question to ask was, did the transmitter fall off the bird? Did something happen to the bird? Is the bird okay? But by seeing that activity, I knew the bird was moving around. I knew it was doing what I would expect it to do, which is forage at night and sit around during the day. And so the activity, and then I saw it kind of get a little quiet towards the end, and then all of a sudden, on April 26th, we got a ping and it was on the move. So here's the track. So it was banded on December 18th in West Cape May at we call it Bob's house, but at the house adjacent to the Meadows. Its first northbound migration was on 425 and then stopped over on the 26th, 28 miles north of Cape May. And then for 6 days, stopped over a little north of that. And then during the night, so that's a big jump, right? Between those yellow points, the yellow points are daytime points and the clear circles are nighttime points. So those clear circles are being reported at night as this bird is moving on this massive flight. And then the third stop was 215 miles from its last stop. So in one night, it flew 215 miles, which is significant when you consider the total length of this track. So the bird waited forever, but then when it took off, it took off. It stopped over for a day after flying 47 miles, and then another day, just a little hop, 17 miles, and then another day, another 17 miles. That one is maybe a little bit off. And then again, midnight, flying up into Maine, and then she hits Maine on May 11th, reached Bridgeton, Maine, 77 miles from her last stop and 438 miles from Cape May. And then she moves up to Bethel, Maine, makes a few short hops, and then finally on May 20th, arrives just outside Stratton, Maine. She stays here until the battery is exhausted on June 4th. Presumably, this is her breeding site. Everything indicated that she was, all the activity kind of dialed down. It was representative of what we would think. My money is on the fact that she decided to breed at that site. Now, it's about 500 miles from Cape May, New Jersey. Every one of these pings is coming off of a cell tower. Every single day, she was able to ping a cell tower. What you're seeing here is absolutely groundbreaking research on a tiny species that can only carry a transmitter that weighs less than 3 grams. The coolest part of that, of course, is that the new transmitters we have now have a GPS in them and still weigh the same amount. So unfortunately, I don't have any data for you for that yet, but we'll have to check in next year. So this past year, Katie Duffy decided she was going to retire from owl banding at Cape May, which kind of ends this 40-plus year data set. And so this group, Mike, Trish, and Charlie and I really felt that this was an important station to keep going if possible. It's one of the first East Coast Northern Saw-Whet Owl stations in existence in the US, and also one of the few current ones in existence. And it's an original Project OwlNet partner. So it's one of the few stations that has records of these recoveries from other stations over the course of the history. So here's a picture of Charlie, just to introduce you to the team. And Charlie, Trish Miller, who's the the executive director of a nonprofit, Conservation Science Global. And then Mike Lanzone, who's transmitted over, we just did the math for a permit application, over 2,300 birds, ranging from hummingbirds now, because we just did some hummingbirds in Mexico, all the way up to golden eagles, which he and Trish are the world's experts on golden eagles. And here he is with a short-eared owl we caught a couple years ago, a great horned owl on the bottom and a long-eared owl up top. Long-eared, spectacular looking birds. So looking ahead, so what are we going to do for the future? Well, our plan is to maintain the Katie's original site, this Project Owlnet site in Cape May, especially that saw wet lane. That is the most consistent part of the whole site. Some of the other owlnets have changed over the years, but that transect has been one of the longest legacy sites. So we want to make sure we keep running that to keep growing that 40-year data set, contributing to the recapture data from Project Owlnet partners. So we want to be able to stay open at those sites. And so we can be catching more of the birds that are coming through from other researchers and giving them those kind of recovery points. This secondary site is potentially going to be used for putting transmitters on. You can see there's two speakers on there. I just want to make it clear, we wouldn't be running both of those speakers simultaneously because they're so close to each other, but we would move one to another site if we were going to do transmittering from that site. And that the reason we would do that is because it's so convenient. The house is like steps away from the banding nets, and it's just easy to do processing and putting transmitters on, et cetera, in that kind of a setting. We're all getting older, so we don't want to live in a tent in the middle of the woods in the winter. The cool thing about the new transmitters, these new flicker GPS transmitters provide increased accuracy. It's GPS accuracy, so it can both hit the cell towers and store data on board and send it when they connect, which is going to give us more specific data on how this owl is using the habitat. So not only is it spending time on the island, but what tree was it roosting at the Meadows? What field was it foraging over? We have a lot of potential actual data that we can collect and then give back to the Conservancy so they can use it to feed in their model for habitat maintenance and management. And I'm only talking about solid owls, but the state is very interested in barred owls and actually transmitting barred owls and seeing how they're using the landscape. Again, they seem to be increasing in Cape May, but there's still a species that's threatened in the state. So there's a lot of other owl research potential here as well. And then we've been taking these data on the road, and that transmitter harness is kind of a new thing. And it's something that it was a bit groundbreaking to find something that, we know that the standard is something that these owls can really get out of. So finding a material and coming up with a method has been a bit groundbreaking. So we've been presenting this. I presented this at the Inland Bird Banding Association meeting in Nashville a few months ago, and there's a lot of owl researchers there as well. So hopefully that's going to contribute to the greater understanding of how we can ethically, safely transmit our birds so we can use the data for conservation. And then I have to acknowledge again, there are a lot of photos in this talk. Lisa Wilcox was a young student who came down with one of the old raptor banders back in the 70s, and so 70s slides that I showed you. She had given me those, which were pretty fascinating, a nice window into history. Suzanne Kultberger is a local photographer who's come out and taken pictures of some of the owls, so I did feature some of hers. And obviously Mike, Trish, and Charlie had supplied some photos. And then the project support and collaboration. The Cape May Science Center has been a phenomenal partner, really stepping up and supporting financially some of the purchase of the transmitters and the house for us to use to do the banding in. I can tell you we are, when I send them pictures of the foosball table and the sunken living room where we can, wait in between net checks versus having to be out in an unheated little structure out in the fields. The Nature Conservancy has been a phenomenal partner, continues to be a phenomenal partner on lots of projects we work on. Conservation Science Global, obviously Trish's group has been great in support, both financially and logistically. New Jersey Audubon and the company I work for, Cellular Tracking Technologies, have all been great supporters of all this research. And I'll bold here and mention her again, Katie Duffy. We only know what we know today to do the work we want to do tomorrow because of the history that's happened here. And so I got to give her lots of credit. I know when I worked at the Bird Observatory, we would talk a lot, and she, this is self-funded, everything, traveling out from Wyoming. I mean, she lives out in Yellowstone, works in Yellowstone National Park. So there she is in the gray shirt. That's with our family. We were out there in 2021 as a cross-country trip, and she met us out there. So she lives out there, does owl work out there, and would come here every year. So sad to see that she's not coming back to continue the project right now, but we're always standing on her shoulders in everything we do. And so she deserves lots of props. So with that, I think I got a few minutes and I will be happy to answer any questions. And everybody should know what that is, but that is a bag. That is the bag that we carry the birds back in. And, they're sweet little birds, but man, they do have some pretty gnarly little talons. They're not big enough to really hurt you, but they can show you what they're trying to do.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that amazing presentation. Kind of on the topic of the talents, somebody had put a question. They noticed in a couple of the photos, people weren't wearing gloves. Do the owls try to bite you while you're banding? Do the talons hurt?
The owls try to bite you. The owls try to foot you. It's in raptor handling, it's called footing, for them to grab you with their talons. These guys are small enough that they'll get their talon around your finger, and then you'll have to kind of wiggle your hand around and peel back their little needles that are piercing you. They're not so bad, and they'll bite you a little bit. But most of their force is in their feet. They catch their prey with their feet, and then they rip it apart with their beak. So the majority of the work, the business end of the owl, is in the feet. And so they will go for you, but they really can't hurt you. Larger owls, that's a different story. Barred owl, one of the barred owls, actually, I was really good. I got the barred owl out, and I wasn't paying attention, which is usually how it gets you. And it got me just in my cuticle, and that thing was gnarly. And I had to have a friend come and help pull that back. Usually, raptor banders don't wear gloves. You'll see gloves more in rehab settings. You're doing a lot with measuring the bird, right? So like, I didn't show you the details of the measuring, but typically I'm holding the bird with one hand, I'm holding the wing out with the other hand, or I'm holding both of those, the wing out and the bird, with one hand, and then I'm using a ruler to kind of measure the wing. So you really can't do that with gloves. So you learn pretty quickly how to handle a raptor, and you stick to that. I don't think I showed any pictures of birds in cans, but there's a whole system of different size cans, and I'm talking cans down to, like, the solid owls fit nicely into a what was that brand? It's the Coco Loco pina colada mix can. That's like the right size especially for a smaller male solid owl. And so you basically slide them into it. There's holes poked in it so that they can breathe just fine. And they're in the dark, so they actually calm down, because these birds are spending so much time in the dark anyway. Now you're taking them into a more lighted environment. It's a little more jarring on the eye. So we try and keep everything dim, but you put them in the can, they calm down. That allows you to grab their leg, you put the band on, they can't really fly away. Then you kind of take them out and measure the wing. So there's a lot of handling that goes on, and you really have to learn how to do that. These are great birds to learn on because they can't really hurt you. But some of the larger ones, man, the raptor banders have stories. I'll just leave it at that.
Awesome. Well, thank you. How long do the owls typically stay in a net before you get them?
Right. So our net checks are at a maximum 30 minutes, every 30 minutes. So it's possible that a saw-whet owl flies into a net as soon as you walked away, in which case the longest time it would be 30 minutes. There's a lot of people have done research on this, and most people historically, people would leave nets for an hour or more. So a bird could potentially be hanging there for over an hour. We don't do that, and I don't think anybody today is doing that. So we try and keep it with 30 minutes. The birds are well insulated. When they fly into these, if anybody hasn't seen this process, the mist nets are called mist nets because they're not really visible. I'm going to move you guys closer. I'm going to move you in front of me so I'm looking at you. I feel like I'm looking at you. The mist nets are really fine mesh, and they have it's very loose, baggy mesh. But then there's these tremel lines that are tight. So what that does is those tremel lines create these pockets. So it looks like a flat wall. It actually looks like nothing. It's almost see-through, but it's essentially a flat wall of net. And the bird flies at one of those shelves and hits that net, flies through, because the net's billowing, right? Flies into that and then falls into the pocket and gets caught in that pocket. So it's soft mesh. It's real baggy. It's made to be a nice little, it's made to be not destructive or not able to hurt the bird. And then the researcher needs to have the experience to go and actually extract it. So you don't let anybody just take birds out of nets. It's a very strict protocol, and you have to be observed. In fact, Katie would never let anybody take a bird out of a net that hadn't demonstrated during the day what they can do, and then go out there and observe them at night multiple times before she ever certified someone as capable of removing birds from the nets. And our project is just us who are doing that. We've taken thousands of birds out of nets. But they go from the net into a bag that also keeps them calm. That's the bag you're seeing in the any questions slide. And then they're brought back to the station. And then when they're processed, they're taken out of the bag, put into a can. We weigh them. We'll put the band on. We'll take them out of the can. They're out of it for a few minutes where we're just measuring and looking at molt, record the molt, and then release them. And so there's a discriminant function, a statistic basically, where we can take the weight and the wing chord, the length of the wing. And for most birds, most individuals, we can, based on those combinations, we can sex them as male or female. And then we use the molt to age them. So those are the age and sex is really important, because if for some reason you saw only young birds coming through, it might indicate that something happened. Well, it could indicate that something happened to the adults. It could indicate that it was a very busy year in the breeding grounds, and it pushed more young birds further south. If you see only adults come through, that's kind of more alarming. That makes you think that there might have been a bad year. And so if you see it one year, it could just be food. But if you start seeing year after year of no young, well, then you might have a population issue. So we want to really make sure we record correctly the age of the birds. And then there could be sex differences as well. So we do think that in the case of saw-whets and long-eared owls, we think that the females move farther south. And so we do catch more females. And so the question is where that boundary is. So are we at the boundary or not? So if we start getting less females, we may kind of wonder, like, are there less in the population, because they tend to be the most common of the two sexes. So the sex and age can really tell us something about population. The tracking, though, is going to be something that gives us a lot more data for a much smaller sample size. So we don't have to put transmitters on lots of birds. We can put them on a few, and that can start to give us a little more information about where these birds are coming from. Where do they ultimately, how far south do they go? And when they're here, what are they doing, and what habitats are they using?
Great, thank you. We have time for maybe 2 more questions here. So let's see. Do the owls get stressed out when the transmitters are attached?
Do the owls get
stressed when the transmitters are attached?
So it's, I want to say no. So the whole process, these owls are very docile, very calm. I always put a caveat here, because we don't know what the owls are doing. We don't know exactly how the owls are feeling. But when you're holding a solid owl and we're doing the processing, like, they'll snap at you, they'll bite at you, they'll try and foot you. But eventually in that process of banning them and getting them, fully processed, they tend to calm down, and some of them even go to sleep. Like, you can stroke their head and they'll close their eyes, and then you take your fingers away and their eyes stay closed, and they kind of just doze off. So as humans, we're anthropomorphizing, but we interpret that as the bird being calm. Obviously, a bird is being handled by something much larger than itself. So the goal, no matter what you think the animal is doing, well, the goal, even if the animal appears calm, if the animal does not appear calm or stressed, it does feel stressed, appear stressed, we let the bird go. We're not going to, there's no need. We're doing this for conservation. There's no benefit in actually hurting a bird that is obviously stressing. But if we're putting a transmitter on a bird and the bird appears calm, even if it appears calm, we're going to do that as fast as possible, as safe as possible, and get it out the door. We're always going to balance that safety. Like, we don't want to just put a transmitter, especially a transmitter that's a little heavier. We don't want to put that on willy-nilly and half-ass, right? We want to make sure that goes out the door as well as it can possibly go on, minimize the amount of time we're handling the bird. And if at any point during that process, there's plenty of times we go to put a transmitter on, we get halfway through and we're like, you know what? I don't like the way the transmitter is fitting. This bird's already been here for 10 minutes. Let's take the transmitter off. Let's let it go, and we'll let it go. That's pretty much protocol.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. It looks like we are right at 2 o'clock here, so I just want to honor everyone's schedule, and we are going to wrap up for the day. Thank you again for joining us, everybody, for this incredible presentation. And I just want to give a special thanks to Dr. David Puma for co-hosting this webinar with us. Just a reminder, if you can't get enough raptor content, please be sure to tune in to the Nature Conservancy's live streamed Osprey camera, which is streamed at this preserve, South Cape May Meadows. I did put a link to that in the chat. We will be going live for that camera in about 2 weeks. And as a reminder, you can expect a follow-up email from us about sometime mid-next week, and it will have the resources that we referenced during this webinar, as well as a link to the recording. So be sure to keep an eye out for that. In the meantime, keep up with us on social media for future events like this. And thank you again for coming out today. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.